A quarter of the entire United States Army was mobilized to find one man. Over 5,000 soldiers, 500 Apache scouts, 30 heliograph stations flashing coded light across mountain ranges that had no roads, no maps, no mercy. The most advanced military communications network the American West had ever seen, built for a single purpose: to locate fewer than 40 human beings hiding in the Sierra Madre. And for more than a year, that network failed completely. Somewhere in the desert between Arizona and Sonora, a small band of Chiricahua Apache men, women, and children was outrunning the world's most industrialized army. On foot, through 120-degree heat, covering distances that broke army mules and left seasoned cavalry officers stunned. What finally ended, it was not a bullet. It was not a battle. It was something the United States Army had never planned for, something that arrived not through force, but through a conversation beside a small fire in the mountains. A conversation that would unmake the resolve of a man who had, by that point, outlasted 3 American generals. This is the account of how one warrior, never a chief, never the leader of more than a few dozen followers, became the reason the U.S. government redefined what victory against an irregular enemy actually meant, and how the empire that hunted him for 30 years never truly defeated him. It negotiated with him instead. Before the confrontation is understood, the imbalance has to be understood first. By 1886, the United States had just fought and won a continental war against Mexico, absorbed the territories that would become Arizona and New Mexico, and was in the final stages of consolidating control over the entire American Southwest. The U.S. Army of the period fielded a professional, rail-supplied, telegraph-connected force. Regiments like the 4th, 6th, and 10th Cavalry rotated through forts, built specifically to contain a population that, by any conventional measure, should never have been a threat. Historical accounts of the campaign describe more than 5,000 regular soldiers, backed by 500 Apache scouts, 100 Navajo scouts, and thousands of armed civilian militia, deployed specifically to contain Geronimo's band. Mexican forces added roughly 3,000 additional troops on the southern side of the border. This was not a manhunt. This was an occupation. Opposing that force, a group that numbered, at various points in the campaign, between 24 and 39 men, women, and children. The surviving remnant of a people who had already been driven, relocated, and confined for over a decade. The man these thousands of soldiers were chasing was born Goyaałé, one who yawns, around June 1829, near the headwaters of the Gila River, in the Bedonkohe band of the Chiricahua Apache. He was never a hereditary chief. He held no formal rank in Apache society. What he held instead was something the Apache called power, a spiritual authority tied to visions and battlefield success that made warriors choose to follow him, not because tradition demanded it, but because his instincts kept them alive. That instinct was forged in loss. In 1858, while Geronimo and other Apache men were in the town of Llanos trading with Mexican merchants, a detachment of Mexican soldiers under Colonel José María Carrasco attacked the undefended camp. Geronimo's mother, his wife Alope, and their 3 children were among those killed. Historical accounts describe Carrasco's stated intent as the elimination of the Apache camp entirely. But the warriors, absent from the camp at the time, largely survived while their families did not. Geronimo returned to find them dead. What followed was not simply grief. It was the beginning of a war that would not end for 3 decades. By the 1870s, the U.S. government had adopted a policy of concentration, forcing Apache bands off their traditional lands and onto reservations, most notably San Carlos in Arizona, a stretch of arid land so poorly suited to Apache life that historical accounts of the period describe crop failure, spoiled rations, and disease as near-constant conditions. It was not neglect. It was policy, a slow strangulation dressed as administration. Between 1876 and 1886, Geronimo escaped that reservation 3 separate times, each time reigniting a campaign that consumed enormous military resources for what, on paper, looked like a negligible enemy. Here is what the U.S. Army understood in 1886: numbers win wars, firepower wins wars, logistics win wars. What the Army did not yet understand, what it would be forced to learn over the following year, was that none of those things mattered against an enemy who did not fight the way the manual said an enemy should fight. The final campaign began in earnest in May 1885, when Geronimo led dozens of followers off the reservation after a night of ceremonial drinking triggered fears of punishment. General George Crook, an experienced Apache campaigner who had previously relied on Apache scouts rather than brute cavalry numbers, pursued with roughly 3,000 men. It accomplished little. Through the winter of 1885 into 1886, Crook's forces hunted through the Sierra Madre and repeatedly lost the trail. In one incident remembered as Ulzana's Raid, a party of just 12 Apache warriors covered an estimated 1,200 miles in a matter of weeks, killed dozens of settlers, and captured hundreds of head of livestock, suffering a single casualty in return. In March 1886, Crook finally negotiated a surrender with Geronimo at Cañón de los Embudos, just across the Mexican border. Contemporary photographs taken by C.S. Fly during those talks remain the only images ever recorded of Native Americans still actively at war with the United States. For a moment, it seemed finished. Then, that same night, a whiskey trader entered the Apache camp and warned Geronimo that his people would be killed the moment they crossed into American territory. Fear did what thousands of soldiers could not. Geronimo, along with the war leader Naich and a handful of followers, vanished back into the mountains before dawn. It was not recklessness. It was self-preservation, built on decades of broken federal promises. The escape cost Crook his career. Criticized in Washington for his failure and his reliance on Apache scouts, he was relieved of command on April 1st, 1886, and replaced by General Nelson Miles, a man who had already built a reputation defeating the Nez Perce a decade earlier. If you're finding the scale of this manhunt as staggering as we did researching it, this is exactly the kind of story this channel exists to tell in full. Subscribe now, because the next campaign season only goes deeper into confrontations history rushed past. Miles rejected Crook's approach entirely. He abandoned the reliance on Apache scouts as the primary strategy and instead leaned on raw industrial capacity. Over 5,000 troops were dispersed into small mobile detachments across the border region. A network of roughly 30 heliograph stations, mirrors flashing coded sunlight across mountain peaks, was constructed to relay Apache movements faster than any rider could carry a message. Soldiers destroyed food caches and water sources wherever Geronimo's band might pass, denying them rest even in their own territory. On paper, it was an overwhelming, mathematically certain victory. In practice, it accomplished almost nothing for months. Captain Henry Lawton's men, hauling roughly 400 pounds of supply per detachment, covered perhaps 20 miles a day across brutal terrain. Geronimo's band, unencumbered, moving with nothing but what they could carry, covered as much as 60 to 80 miles in the same span. The Army's greatest asset, its overwhelming mass, had become its greatest liability. A force built to occupy territory could not catch a force built to disappear from it. It was not a failure of soldiers. It was a failure of design. By July 1886, Miles had exhausted the conventional options. He turned to a man who did not fit the profile of a typical field officer, Lieutenant Charles Gatewood, who spoke Apache fluently and had spent years building relationships with Chiricahua scouts rather than simply commanding them. Miles ordered Gatewood into the Sierra Madre with a small, lightly armed escort, essentially unprotected, walking directly toward the one man 5,000 soldiers had failed to capture. On August 24, 1886, Gatewood found Geronimo's camp in the Sonora Mountains. What happened next was not a battle. It was a conversation beside a small fire, and it succeeded where 5,000 rifles had not. Gatewood delivered the news without softening it. Every Chiricahua Apache, including those who had remained peacefully on the reservation and never taken up arms, was being deported to Florida by rail. Geronimo's own family was already gone. There would be no homeland left to defend, no people left to protect by continuing to fight. Historical accounts describe this moment as the point that broke Geronimo's will. Not artillery, not casualties, not starvation, but the simple, devastating realization that resistance no longer had anything left to preserve. It was not defeat by force. It was defeat by information, a single fact, delivered honestly by one man who understood Apache language and Apache values well enough to make it land. Geronimo agreed to surrender, but only to Miles personally. The band began moving north toward the border, arriving at Skeleton Canyon on August 28, 1886. Miles himself reached the site on September 3rd. The location, overlooking both the San Bernardino and San Simon valleys, was reportedly favored by Geronimo precisely because it offered clear sight lines in every direction. A final negotiation held on terrain the Apache leader chose, not the army. On September 4, 1886, Geronimo formally surrendered, handing over a Winchester rifle, serial number 12945 Urdu, still preserved today at West Point, along with a Colt revolver he had carried through decades of conflict. Historical records attribute to him a brief statement at the moment of surrender, that he had once moved like the wind and now surrendered, and that was all. It was the final formal surrender of an armed Native American resistance to the United States government. There is a bitter irony sitting at the center of this ending, and it is worth sitting with before moving forward. Because what happens next reframes everything that came before it, and this channel exists precisely to trace what conventional retellings leave out. If that kind of full-picture history is what keeps you watching, the subscribe button is right there, and there's a great deal more of this coming. Miles had promised the surrendering Apache a limited exile, with an eventual return to Arizona. That promise was broken immediately and permanently. Geronimo and his band, 18 warriors, 13 women, and 6 children by the final count at Skeleton Canyon, were loaded onto railroad cars and sent first to Fort Pickens in Florida, then later to Alabama, and finally to Fort Sill in Oklahoma Territory. Geronimo himself would spend 23 years as a prisoner of war. He would never again set foot in the homeland he had spent 30 years defending. At Fort Sill, the man who had once been the single most hunted individual on the North American continent became, improbably, something closer to a public curiosity. He took up farming. He converted to Christianity, joining the Dutch Reformed Church, though accounts describe a complicated and incomplete relationship with the faith. He appeared as an attraction at the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair, selling photographs of himself and bows he had made. In 1905, he rode in President Theodore Roosevelt's inaugural parade, one of 6 Native Americans included in the procession. A former enemy of the state paraded as spectacle in the capital of the nation that had exiled him. In 1906, he dictated his life story to S.M. Barrett, published as an autobiography, one of the only first-hand Apache accounts of the period available in Geronimo's own voice, filtered though it was through translation and a government-approved editorial process. He died at Fort Sill on February 17, 1909, of pneumonia, reportedly after being thrown from a horse and lying in the cold overnight. He was roughly 80 years old. He was buried in the Apache prisoner of war cemetery at Fort Sill, in Oklahoma soil, thousands of miles from the mountains where he was born. There's one more layer to this story that most retellings skip entirely: the part where an empire's overwhelming force became irrelevant to its own outcome. And it deserves 15 more minutes to unpack properly. This is the kind of detail this channel is built around. So, if it's landing, subscribing means you won't miss where this thread leads next. What the campaign against Geronimo ultimately proves is not the strength of the United States Army in 1886. It proves its limitation. 5,000 soldiers, a heliograph network spanning an entire territory, 3,000 additional Mexican troops, thousands of armed civilians. None of it captured Geronimo. What ended 30 years of resistance was not superior firepower. It was superior information, delivered by one man willing to walk unarmed into the camp of the enemy and tell the truth. It was not a military collapse. It was the collapse of a reason to keep fighting. That distinction matters because it says something that outlasts the specific dust of Skeleton Canyon. Empires build their confidence on scale, on soldiers, on supply lines, on the sheer mathematics of overwhelming force. But scale cannot chase what it cannot see, cannot starve what does not need to eat where it is expected to, and cannot defeat a man whose resistance was never really about the odds in the first place. Geronimo was not undone by 5,000 rifles. He was undone by the last thing he had left to lose. And by then, there was nothing force alone could have taken from him that hadn't already been taken 30 years earlier, beside a burned camp outside a town called Llanos,